Welcome to Shooting Straight with A1F.com. I'm Frank Miniter, the editor-in-chief of America's First Freedom. Today we have the great honor of speaking with David Keene. David is a former president of the NRA, a current board member of the NRA. He was a presidential advisor. He was opinion editor for the Washington Times, and I'm just scratching your resume there, David. But you just wrote a feature for America's First Freedom called The Importance of the NRA at 150. And I was hoping to start with your perspective on just what got us to a place where the President of the United States, Joe Biden, is calling the NRA his enemy, and he says he must defeat us. What got us here, David?
Well, Joe Biden, throughout his career, has been one of the major anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment politicians in this country. He's been at the forefront of every effort to restrict firearms rights, and he knows, as do most anti-Second Amendment politicians, that the road to firearms restrictions runs right through the National Rifle Association, because without either pushing the NRA off the battlefield, demonizing the NRA, getting people not to listen to the NRA, or destroying it, as some politicians now want to do, they cannot get the restrictions on Second Amendment rights that they've been seeking for so long. You know, we go through these battles periodically, and people wonder, why do they keep doing this? They keep doing it because it's almost, in the anti-gunners world, it's almost like a religion. Many of these people actually believe that if Americans disarmed, we'd live in a domestic utopia. It's very much like in the 70s and 80s, the anti-nuclear movement worldwide, which held that if we just disarmed, the rest of the world would do the same, and we'd live in an international utopia with peace on the horizon forevermore. And that becomes a religious kind of feeling. And in this country, the Michael Bloombergs and all of these people actually believe that if they disarm the police, if they disarm the citizenry, if they ban guns, if they restrict guns, if they take them away from people, the criminals will not be criminals anymore, and we won't have to worry. That was crazy internationally, and it's crazier still in this country today, because people need firearms. The Second Amendment is in the Bill of Rights for a very good reason, and they know that they can't accomplish what they want to accomplish unless they run over the National Rifle Association, and that's really where it comes from. That's where the anti-gun feeling morphs in to hatred of the NRA and all that we stand for, because we're the one thing standing in their way of accomplishing what they want.
Right, the NRA is a cornerstone of freedom, protecting our Bill of Rights and thus our Constitution, so they have to dislodge us.
That's exactly right. And Americans believe that. You know, I was president of the NRA during the gunfight with Barack Obama's administration. And when that began, everybody thought he was going to accomplish much of what he wanted to accomplish in terms of firearms restrictions. And you may recall that when he announced his anti-gun crusade, he began by suggesting that the NRA, while it may once have been a powerful and effective organization, wasn't any longer. Because, as he put it, most gun owners agreed with him, and politicians didn't need to worry about the NRA. When it was all over, they accomplished nothing. There were demonstrations, there were hundreds of thousands of phone calls. NRA members and Second Amendment believers who aren't even part of the NRA did what they always do. When they know clearly that their rights are threatened, they stand up. They cross party lines if they have to. They vote. They give money to politicians that support them. They lobby. They make the phone calls. They do all of the things that an involved citizenry is supposed to do. And the result of that is that they win. They win for another reason as well. And this was sort of summed up to me when it was over. One of these progressive bloggers asked a question on his blog. He said, "Why is it that when these battles begin, it looks like we're going to win everything, and then when they're over, more people support gun ownership than did when it all began?" And the reason for that is twofold. One, when the debate takes place, people begin to realize that their proposals have no practical effect except to harass legal firearms owners. They don't deal with crime. They don't deal with mass shootings. They don't do any of these things. Take the current offensive that they launched. They're talking about they need all of these things. All of these things that they want were in effect in Colorado, a state where the shootings took place, a state which is at the forefront of firearms control legislation. Didn't impact that. Didn't impact the shooter out there. Didn't prevent the shooting. Doesn't prevent crime. And that becomes clear to people in the course of the debate. And secondly, and just as important, I think, is, as I put it in the past, the appreciation of the Second Amendment, of the right to defend oneself, of the right to legitimately own firearms to defend not just oneself, but one's family, one's community, is deeply ingrained in the DNA of America. This country began because private citizens own firearms. And when push comes to shove, when the chips are down, people realize that, and it affects the way they act on these political matters. So that's why the NRA has been so important. Not because the NRA represents every gun owner, but because every gun owner and believer in the Second Amendment looks to the NRA, our members as well as non-members, looks to the NRA for the leadership and as the Paul Revere, if you will, of the Second Amendment defense forces, that comes and says, this is important. You've got to do it. And when they realize that, they're mobilized, they act, and they defend their interests. And I think that's why these politicians really despise the National Rifle Association.
I remember asking you, and I think it was in 2012 during CPAC, just what got this freedom issue going, what got us off his feet, especially in the 90s. And you said that Wayne LaPierre had come to you and come to many others and said, we need to let people know this is a freedom issue.
That's exactly what it is. And people realize that. There was a time, if you go back to the 150 years of the NRA's existence, prior to the 1960s, prior to the beginning of what we have come historically to call the culture wars in American politics, the NRA didn't have lobbyists, didn't have a political arm, didn't need a political arm, didn't really need lobbyists because there was no disagreement on the meaning of the Second Amendment. There was no real, any kind of organized, meaningful opposition to Second Amendment rights. It wasn't until the mid 1960s that began to develop, and it developed. If there's a corollary, analogous kind of political situation, it's the way that the abortion issue, which never used to be a partisan issue, became partisan, then became sort of the mantra of progressives that they had to, so that a liberal or a Democrat, for example, who was opposed to abortion couldn't speak at conventions, couldn't be tolerated, were driven out of the party because it became monolithically necessary to be on the right side of that issue. The same thing has happened within the National Democratic Party on gun control issues. This never used to be a partisan issue. It has become one because of the progressives and because of their feeling that the Second Amendment represents more than just the right to bear arms. It means more than that. It symbolizes an America that they don't like. And that dislike of that America has become more and more clear over the last few years. They want a European social democracy, not the kind of republic that the founders envisioned. And the Second Amendment sort of represents the American ideal of individual responsibility that goes way beyond guns. And that leads into their opposition to firearms ownership.
Well, there are a lot of Democrats right now who are actually pro-gun. A lot of them have bought guns over the last year and a half.
An awful lot of them. You know, the NRA not only was the gun issue not political, and when I'm talking politically as a political issue, I'm talking about elected officials, Democratic Party leaders. I'm not talking about Democratic voters or people who identify as Democrats. Heck, I began as a Democrat. My first political activity was passing out literature for John Kennedy in the 1960 primary in Wisconsin. My father most of his life was a union organizer. My mother was the 5-term president of the Women's Auxiliary of the United Auto Workers. So I don't exactly come from some country club Republican background. And the influence of the NRA has been precisely because of the fact that the gun issue, the Second Amendment, is not partisan, and that people who believe in the Second Amendment are willing to cross party lines if they have to. So the influence of the NRA in terms of the current battle, where the opposition to firearms ownership centers within the National Democratic Party, the influence of the NRA is enhanced because if you're a Democratic auto worker, steel worker, whatever, in the Midwest, and your representative comes out against firearms, regardless of what party that representative is from, and you know that they're doing that, you're going to vote for his or her opponent. And that makes the NRA much more influential than most advocacy groups. And remember, Frank, you know this as well as I do. The NRA is, if you ask someone on the street, what's the NRA? It's the Second Amendment advocacy group. It defends the Second Amendment, and that's crucial. But that's not all the NRA is. We spend maybe on all of our lobbying, all of our political activity, maybe 8 or 9% of the funds that we raise. The rest of it goes into the traditional work that the NRA does in terms of shooting competitions, technical work, safety instructions, all of the things that have been the core of the National Rifle Association's work for 150 years. But it's that advocacy that becomes so important during times when Second Amendment rights are threatened. You know, ILA, the Institute for Legislative Action, the political arm of the NRA, was formed in the 1970s really at the insistence of a Democratic congressman from Michigan, who said to us, look, you can train all the people in safety that you want. You can run all the competitions that you want. You can do all of those things. None of it's going to matter. That was John Dingell, a senior Democrat. And Dingell said, it's not going to matter because unless you step up to the plate, unless you defend the Second Amendment itself, nobody's going to have a gun to hunt. Nobody's going to have a gun to protect themselves. Nobody's going to be involved in gun collection or collecting or international shooting or the like, because guns are going to be taken away from us. You have to step up. And the NRA did. Formed the Institute for Legislative Action, has been very involved since that time, and has emerged as sort of the quarterback and the Paul Revere of the Second Amendment. And that combination is as vital today as it's ever been, because today the folks that oppose the Second Amendment are not stupid. You know, we may think that their views are a little nutty, but the fact is they're smart people with a lot of money, a lot more money than the NRA has ever had, and they're willing to spend it, and they become more sophisticated as time goes on. And they propose to presidents, as they did to Barack Obama and to Joe Biden when he went into office. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can do by executive action. Here's what you can do by legislation and by regulation. And you can do these things without really letting people know what you're up to if you're careful. And that's in part what Democrats try to do. Joe Biden has been different because usually in a campaign, a candidate for president with Joe Biden's record on guns would have a difficult time. This campaign was unique in 2020 because, you know, just as an example, in a normal election year, the candidate who's best regarded on the economy does very well because the economy is always the number one issue. In fact, Donald Trump got 65% of the votes of people who rated the economy as number one. Unfortunately, the economy wasn't number one. The pandemic was number one. And that's what elected Joe Biden, because if you're in power during these kinds of times, you have problems. And he benefited from that. We tried, and we did, and so did everybody else that was involved, try to warn the public about what was going to happen on guns. And ordinarily, that would have great impact. It still had great impact, but it had great impact below the presidential level. There are more pro-Second Amendment votes in the House, and certainly, and we were crucial in saving the Senate. So that was what happened this time. He was elected on the pandemic. People who ran against guns or were viewed to be anti-gun and anti-Second Amendment at the Senate and House levels didn't do so well because we were able to alert voters on that.
Right? He
So,
wasn't talking about either was Kamala Harris in the months before the election. He wasn't talking about the Second Amendment. He was
well,
purposely.
the interesting thing, Frank, is that I don't you undoubtedly know the story of the Las Vegas newspaper, uh, because Joe Biden was vocal about his dislike of firearms and dislike of the Second Amendment up to the time he secured the nomination. You'll remember he appointed Beto O'Rourke to be the head of his task force on the Second Amendment. Beto O'Rourke, who bragged that he wants to take our guns away, and he gave an editorial, had an editorial conference with the Las Vegas newspaper just before the caucuses, in which he talked at length about his views on the Second Amendment, and the paper decided that it would not be in his interest or theirs to release that part of the interview. So they killed it until after the election. Then they released it saying, now that he's president, people may want to know what his views are on this. No, people wanted and needed to know his views before they voted for him, because that might have affected the vote. And they knew that. They knew that when they cut that out. They knew it when he said it, and they decided that they needed to protect him.
Much of the mainstream media did. But looking back into the past again, Gore lost his home state, lost the presidency, largely because of his Second Amendment positions at the time. Is that history going to repeat itself, or?
Yeah, partly it's because they keep trying. As I said earlier, it's quasi-religious. One of the aspects of a quasi-religious movement is that facts don't matter. So you can demonstrate empirically that the proposals they make don't work. That doesn't faze them. In fact, during these debates, they'll say, "Well, yeah, no, but they may not work, but we need to do something. What we need to do is harass legal gun owners, because the ultimate goal has always been what they like to call a gun-free society." They don't talk about that after they lose elections on the Second Amendment, but as far back as 1968, when the most restrictive firearms legislation ever proposed actually passed, which was the Gun Control Act of 1968 under the Johnson administration, Teddy Kennedy said that was a good first step to the elimination of firearms in this country. That's always been the fantasy goal, at least, of the anti-gun movement. They won't talk that. They'll talk about common sense regulation. They'll talk about all these things. But what they really want to do is, in the interim, make purchasing, owning, using, having a firearm as painful and as expensive as possible, through taxes, through regulations, through registration, through all of the things that have been proposed. But the ultimate goal at the end is what they like to describe as this perfect gun-free society. And we need not forget that. All along the way, as the NRA has fought these proposals, even some within our own membership have said, well, why do we have this, camel's nose under the tent attitude that we can't give in and we can't compromise, because if we do, we'll lose everything. They don't want to do everything, take everything. They just want these common sense restrictions. Well, they do want everything. And everything is another step in the direction that they want to go. It was very interesting. As a good example, Frank, is of both political sensitivity, even on the part of our adversaries, is the whole story of the so-called assault weapons ban. When the so-called assault weapons ban was enacted in the 90s, statistically, not very many people owned AR-15s or the guns like that. That's why they were able to ban them, because there wasn't a huge voting constituency in favor of them. In fact, I was at a Friends of the NRA dinner in Montana a couple of years ago, and stayed with a rancher who was an NRA supporter, and we were having a drink and a cigar after the dinner, and he said, Dave, I have to apologize. And I said, why? He said, well, back in the 90s, I'd been a life member of the NRA, and I almost quit because of your hostility to banning the AR-15. He said, I kept thinking that makes sense, that they're not used that much for hunting. Nobody uses them. Why do they want to be so obstreperous? And he said, fortunately, I didn't. And I want to both apologize and thank you, because now I own 14 of them, and I love them and I use them all the time. And I want to thank the NRA for its foresight. Well, the reason that the new version of the assault weapons ban that Dianne Feinstein said after the shooting in Connecticut that she'd had in her desk just waiting to introduce never made it to the floor was because the Senate Democratic leadership at the time realized that these were no longer guns that nobody owned. They were owned by millions of people. There were hundreds of companies that were providing parts or finished firearms, and they were the guns that, of course, the Supreme Court had said can't be banned because they're widely owned and commonly used for legitimate purposes. So it didn't even make it to the floor, because no matter how strongly you are, 80% of the members of any legislative body have one primary goal. That's being there when the next session of that legislature is called into session. So 80% of them look at that, as they did during that battle during the Obama years, and looked at it and said, the NRA isn't dead. There are millions of members out there, and there are millions of other Americans who agree with them, and they vote on this issue. And golly, we ought to be careful what we do. But then they forget that. I mean, if you look at the history of this from the 60s, when the NRA got involved in those races, I was in Washington. I was actually working at the Nixon White House. And I guess you could say that the first scalp that was tacked to the wall was Joe Tidings of Maryland. Joe Tidings was a senator in Maryland. He was considered to be very popular. Maryland even then was what we would today call a blue state, and the NRA was just getting active in a public way on advocacy questions. Joe Tidings had been the major sponsor of the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Johnson Gun Control Bill. And he proved what politicians since then have often proved, and that is that he didn't know how to read a poll. Because at that time, gun control were magic words. The public, everybody supported this. It seemed like apple pie. So he said, why should I run from a few nutty gun owners? And he revised his campaign, and his advertisements all argued that he should be reelected because he was the sponsor of the Gun Control Act of 1968. I remember that election day. We didn't have all this sophisticated stuff that we have today. You didn't know by the minute and second what was happening. And we were sitting with some of us in the White House, and somebody said, "What's going on in Maryland in that Tidings race?" And somebody else said, "Well, I don't know. Why don't we call our guy on the ground over there?" And so we called him, and he said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "But I can tell you this, outside of Baltimore City and Montgomery County, Maryland, which is the wealthy suburban county in Maryland," he said, "there are long lines of pickup trucks at all the polling places, and they've all got gun racks in the back window," which you could still have in those days. And when it was over, Tidings was defeated. And at that point, the candidates that were anti-gun sort of pulled away for a couple of years. Then they came back with the Al Gore, Bill Clinton assault on firearms in the 90s, the assault weapons ban, all of the other things that he did, the encouragement of those who wanted to try and sue gun makers out of business, which of course Biden is trying to restart today. And when it was over, they had lost the Congress because of the 1994 for the first time in 40 years. And then in 2000, Al Gore, according to Bill Clinton, lost 6 states, including his home state of Tennessee, purely because of the Second Amendment and, in Bill Clinton's words, the NRA. So then they pulled back. You'll remember after that, for a couple of years, you had John Kerry wearing a camouflage suit with a price tag still on it. You had Democratic national politicians saying they were hunters and all of this, and they pulled away from it. A few years passed, and they were right back again. So if there's ever an issue in American politics where you can say you can't really win the war, you can only win battles, and it necessitates that those who care about it be ready and willing to fight the next battle, or they'll lose what they won in the battle before. And I think gun owners understand that. I think they've come to understand it. You know, when I was president of the NRA, Barack Obama was running for re-election in 2012. He actually ran ads, if you'll remember, in many rural areas saying, I sort of like his thing on your doctor, I will not take your gun. I am a supporter of the Second Amendment. I will not take your rifle. I will not take your shotgun. I will not take your handgun. I had on my desk several hundred letters from NRA members saying, we're so disappointed in your leadership because it's clear that he is not a threat to the Second Amendment. Of course, he was busy taking over the medical sector of the economy during his first term. And some of them saying we want to resign from the NRA because all you're doing is making this false charge in order to hype the issue and raise money. And I didn't answer those letters. I let them sit on my desk until Barack Obama made that speech in which he said he was going to go after your guns. And then I answered all of them and said, I said, you'll be happy to know that I did not send your resignation as a member to our membership office. I waited until I could answer you, and I'm answering you now. You can still resign if you want to, but we're going to fight for your rights even if you do.
Right, Operation Choke Point, Fast and Furious. It just went on and on with Obama.
It was incredible, but it was nothing as compared to what's going on now.
Right.
If Joe Biden has his way with this progressive majority in the House, the Second Amendment will become meaningless. But it's going to require more than the passage of one of these crazy House bills in the Senate. It's going to require, first of all, the elimination of the filibuster, which has consequences far beyond the Second Amendment itself. And then, and as I said before, these people aren't stupid. They know what they're doing. So if you look at the Democratic leadership's agenda this year in the Senate, one, they want to add 2 states, 4 new senators from the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico to lock in their control of the Senate, regardless of the public, because they know that there'll be a backlash to what they're doing. And they want to be able to live through that backlash and survive and not be tossed out in the way that they have been tossed out every other time they've gone after our rights. So one, you secure the Senate. And then secondly, you get rid of the filibuster so you can get the things done. But they also know that much of what's being proposed is flatly unconstitutional. Now, does it make sense that they're going to expend all of this political capital to pass restrictive bills to eliminate rights that are just going to be struck down by the Supreme Court? It doesn't, which is why the president has now suggested they need a commission to talk about reforming the Supreme Court. That means packing it so that the Heller decision, the McDonald decision, the other decisions that the court might make can be reversed, and we can be informed that the Second Amendment doesn't mean much at all. We've already had an appeals court say that the right to bear arms doesn't exist. You can't bear them openly, and you can't bear them concealed. You've got jurisdictions in the judicial system that have ignored the language in the Heller decision relating to commonly owned firearms and your inability to ban them. They want to get rid of all that, and if that requires them to not just change the structure of the United States Senate, but to change the institutional structure of the United States Supreme Court, they're willing to do that. And so gun owners and other Americans as well who care about freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all of the things that are at threat, have to worry not just about bills that are specific to their interests, but about the bills that make it possible for legislation that might never otherwise be enacted into law to become law. And the Democratic leadership is confident that they can get away with this because, as their pollsters have told them, Americans don't focus on process issues. They might be a little bit upset about the filibuster. They don't really understand it. We can call it a racist kind of deal. They don't really, they'll accept the Supreme Court. That doesn't affect any specific right. But the fact is those things relate to all a lot of rights, and that's what's at stake in this particular time.
What I'm hearing here is you see us in very dangerous waters right now, but I also hear hope on the horizon as we head towards the midterm election.
That's exactly right, because as I said, 80% of the people that sit in legislative bodies have one eye on on their agenda. Some of them don't even have an agenda. Let's face it; they're just happy being where they are, and their major goal is to keep coming back to where they are and to enjoy. Somebody once said that people get elected to Congress in Washington, describing it as a swamp or a sewer, and find out that in fact it's a hot tub, and they can get used to it pretty quickly. They become acclimated to Washington, and they come into the culture, and they want to stay there. So that is actually a weapon that benefits us, because in order to get what they want, the leadership, the political leadership, the progressive wing of their party has to convince those people that it's not politically risky. They know that can't be done, so they're saying, well, it will be politically risky, but we're going to protect you because we're going to change the rules so that they can't throw you out just because they're mad at you. Our job is to make sure those rules don't change. And if the people understand in the next few months what's going on, they will stand up the way we stand up at election time on purely Second Amendment issues, because these are Second Amendment issues. And there are a lot of senators. There are more Democrats at risk this year that are at risk on these issues in some states than there are Republicans. So that has to be of concern to them. If you're running in a gun-friendly state, and you realize that if the voters in that state know what you're really up to, regardless of what you say, that they're probably not going to vote for you, and that's going to give you pause. And if that gives you pause, it means you may not vote the way your leaders expect you to, or you may put pressure on them to pull some of these things, as Democratic senators did on the so-called assault weapons ban during the Obama years, saying, we don't need that. Let's not do it. It's not that important. It risks everything else we're going to do. And regardless of whether Joe Biden wants to do it, or Kamala Harris wants to do it, or Chuck Schumer wants to do it, or Nancy Pelosi wants to do it, they have to worry about the concerns of their members. In this last election, the House is now narrowly divided. I mean, they had a significant majority prior to 2020. They don't now. And it doesn't take many switches to turn that House back over to the.
I think it's 6 seats.
Yeah, and
a couple of switches, right.
If you're in the majority, the last thing you want is to get it turned over to the other party, because in the House, being a part of the minority means you have nothing. So once you get a taste of having everything, nothing doesn't sound as good as it might to somebody from a state legislature who wants to come to Washington. So that's our one advantage, and knowing that the public out there basically supports our views, and even more of them support us if the debate goes on long enough, and if they get to process what's actually being proposed, then we have reason for hope. Because if they don't change these rules prior to the off-year election, I would predict that the House is going to be in real trouble. And if they lose the House, then they lose a lot, because they can't initiate the things that they've been able to initiate so far. And if everything depends on changing the rules in the Senate to govern without the fear of backlash, then you've got something that is so obvious to the voters that it's going to result in long-term losses for the gun control crowd.
Well, it's telling that Texas just picked up congressional seats and the NRA. That says a lot about where we're headed.
That's exactly right. So I'm not in the least bit pessimistic. I just think we have to realize that these are dangerous waters that we're in, and that we cannot let up even for a minute during this period, because the threat's real, and it's more real than it probably has been since the late 1960s. You remember, but think about the progress we're talking about. This is the 150th anniversary of the NRA, and think about the progress we've made. In 1968, after Lyndon Johnson passed the Gun Control Act of 1968, Richard Nixon came in, and his administration proposed the banning of the manufacture, sale, or possession of handguns within 10 years. So gun controllers were basically in charge. If you went back to 1968, a time when the only two states that allowed concealed carry were Arizona and Vermont. I always say Vermont's a state that's populated by armed socialists. If you told them that in not too many years, every state in America would allow concealed carry, they would think you were insane. But today they do. What we've seen since the mobilization of believers in the Second Amendment since the late 60s is, in spite of all the assaults, we've seen a steady growth in the rights under the Second Amendment. And that growth has been led by the National Rifle Association. So that's why I say it's as important today as it was then. Our adversaries know that without us, they've got the upper hand. It's why right now they're trying to actually destroy the NRA through lawsuits in New York. And I predict that's not going to happen. We're as we speak, the NRA is in hearings in Texas where we're reorganizing to leave New York and reorganize corporately in Texas, a firearms-friendly state with 400,000 NRA members. I tell people in part, some years ago, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, said there were two things he didn't want in New York: conservatives and guns. So I said, well, so we're just doing what he suggested. We're leaving. And all of this was the fault of Ulysses S. Grant and Phil Sheridan and the early founders of the National Rifle Association, because they didn't have the foresight to know that New York was going to turn bad in 150 years. But it has. And they make no bones about it, that their whole effort is to destroy the NRA. And it's the reason, for example, that once this effort in New York began, that the American Civil Liberties Union, which is not usually an organization one finds in bed with the National Rifle Association, has been right there with us saying, you can't do this. You cannot set out to destroy an organization, to weaponize the legal system, and to use it to destroy people you disagree with simply because you disagree with them. That's what that's about. I predict that's not going to work. I predict that we're not going to lose all of our rights as long as gun owners around the country step up to the plate as they have in the past. When I was president of the NRA, I used to tell our lobbyists, when you go into Congress or the Senate, or when our state lobbyists go into the House, they all think they're really cool, articulate, suave lobbyists. That's not why you get an appointment. That's not why you see the congressman or the senator, and it's not why you have influence. You have influence because they know that standing behind you are millions and millions of Americans whose values and views you are there to give voice to. And as long as those millions and millions of America stands behind supporters of the Second Amendment, as they have in the past, I'm very optimistic as to the outcome.
I'm even optimistic in a weird way on New York. As a lifelong New Yorker, with the Supreme Court now accepting the case, the NRA's challenged New York City's overly restrictive gun laws, to put it very lightly. If the Supreme Court rules like I hope they will, and like their records show they will, imagine that freedom breathing in New York. That could begin to change even New York City.
I once gave a speech to a firearms dinner outside of Buffalo. And I said, whenever I come to New York, and I used to work for Jim Buckley, who was a New York senator years and years ago. And I said, when people talk about this part of New York, they refer to it as upstate. I said, I'm a Midwesterner. As far as I can see, this is part of the eastern fringe of the Midwest. It was the only standing ovation I got that night. But the fact is that New York, once you get out of the city, is a pretty sensible place. And the problem is the city and the politics of the city. And as a consequence of that, the politics of the state, which is dominated by the city. It's very much like Illinois in that sense, where most of Illinois consists of really sane people, both Democrats and Republicans, who have no voice because of Chicago. Both Chicago itself and Chicago's influence on the state legislature because of its size. Same thing happens in California. We at the NRA support those gun owners as much as we can. Just because their states are unfriendly doesn't mean they don't deserve support. So, as you know, we're there on these lawsuits. We're there to help them. And we hope that they will have some impact. And they could, because the people of New York are not stupid either.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Mr. Keene. This has been fantastic.
Anytime.